Good morning, and my topic is evaluating music teacher effectiveness with regards to age gap between the teacher and the student. So basically, will you being substantially older than your students affect your effectiveness as an educator? And usually we would expect that the more experienced you are, the better you are in your profession. But with music teachers, there are two things that can kind of hinder that as we get older, mainly becoming out of touch with the newest research and best practices. So you might not, that's where my subtitle, can you teach an old dog new tricks? You might be using your old tricks, and there are newer, better ones out there that you just are not aware of. And then becoming out of touch with your students themselves. So the youth culture, youth music culture, what are they into? How can you relate that to your everyday instruction to, make them buy into what they're doing more? That can decrease as you get older, as you become less and less interested in what they are interested in. Okay. So my first article was matching music teachers' self-conception with students' perception on teaching effectiveness in an unfavorable secondary classroom context. So very specific, but it's basically matching up what the students think is important about music education, or things that greatly contribute to the quality of music education, versus what the teacher thinks is more important. And interestingly enough, in the literature review, there was a stark contrast between when students and teachers were asked who was the most impactful in that situation. They got opposite responses. The students said that they viewed the teacher as the most important aspect of the classroom, whereas the teachers said that the students had more effect on the overall efficiency of the classroom. So background information, the school is located in Northwest Hong Kong. The music teacher, here's where we get into how it was not a very favorable condition. So she didn't have the resources she would like. That's a very common problem for music educators worldwide. You never have exactly what you would like to have. There was a large student population at the school, and these two are related. So the large numbers of academically unmotivated students. So they had a lot of immigrants coming from mainland China. And when the immigrants got there and integrated into the school systems, they found that they were several years behind their native Hong Kong counterparts. So that would lead to them having to be remediated. Frequently, they discuss seeing 12-year-olds seeing 15-year-olds studying in the same class with 12-year-olds because they were that far behind. And it bled over into the music classroom, where they were so far behind that it was very difficult to get those students to buy into anything. They just felt like stuff was flying over their heads. So what's the point of even trying? And it wasn't all academic deficits. A lot of them had trouble with English. They weren't as fluent in English. And since that was the primary language of instruction, they struggled there too. So there were academic deficits as well as the language barrier, and it led to them being very unmotivated. So the method, this was a case study. They studied one class and one teacher. There were two researchers for this study. They came on 2 dates. That was one thing that I would have liked to see more of. I would like to see them spend more time in the environment. But this entire study was conducted on the data collection was conducted on 2 different days. The data collection consisted of video recordings, live observations, and interviews. So they did the recordings and live observations simultaneously first, took field notes, and after that, they used the field notes to create interview questions. After they took all the notes and reviewed the recordings, they triangulated the data to make sure that they were accurate in what they observed, and they used that to create the interview questions for the interview section of the data collection. Findings. So, out of the observations, interviews of students, and interviews of the teacher, there were 4 aspects of the music educator that came through. So going back to how the students perceive the teacher as being an important part, but the teacher perceive the students as having more effect over the outcome of the lesson. It is a partnership, but it's not an equal partnership at all. It's 80-20 in favor of the teacher being more important. So here are the four aspects of the music educator themselves that came out as being very influential over the quality of music education provided. So first of all, their personality. This music teacher happened to be very enthusiastic about her job and about teaching in general, and that helped a lot with the unmotivated students. When they saw that she was very passionate about not only music, but them learning the music, it helped not only the unmotivated students, but the students who were kind of on the fence, who, didn't care, they bought into it too. So it helps a lot for you to be enthusiastic and for the students to basically know that you care. Pedagogy style. So they talked a lot about student-centered versus teacher-centered. Student-centered being the more modern way of teaching, whereas teacher-centered is more archaic, but it's easier with the large class sizes. Since she was dealing with classes of about 40 students, they went ahead and said that it would be best to use a mixed approach where students do get some leeway, they get some input on what they're learning and how they're learning it, but not completely. You can't individualize for 40 students every class. It's not going to work. So for her, because of her large class sizes, she had to strike a balance between the student-centered and the teacher-centered approach. Competence. Her students mentioned that she was very, very good at what she did, and she instructed primarily by singing and playing the recorder, and she just had a really good ear. So they said that she could listen to a song, think for a few moments, and play the entire song on the recorder. They said that she had beautiful tone, beautiful stage presence. She was just very good at what she did. So the students saw that, and they respected her for it. They respected her a lot. And she would frequently use her own performance as incentives to get them to buy in. So if you behave this way, or if you do this by a certain time, I'll perform this popular song in class. And lastly was her philosophy of teaching. Again, this goes back to what she viewed her role was in music education. And it goes back to the students knowing that you really, really care about, or that she really, really cares about them learning music. And also her approach to it, she did have high standards, but she was not intimidating. That was a big thing. The students said that they knew that she cared and that she was going to teach them music, and she was going to make sure that they were engaged, but not in a way that made them feel belittled or intimidated. So that was a huge plus for teaching in these kind of conditions. My next article is entitled Critical Thinking Disposition of Music Teachers. And so this one was more about how important critical thinking is, and in education, both to the student and the teacher, and trying to establish or observe any relationships between critical thinking ability and one's own personal traits. So, critical thinking, I just said it's very important. Students develop best when they are doing activities that require them to think critically. So not just someone up there in the front of the room talking about it and saying, well, this is what it is, this is how you can apply it, here are some situations. The examples are good, but experience is better. So for a teacher, and it requires critical thinking from the top down to create that scenario, the teacher has to have critical thinking skills themselves in order to design an activity that engages the students, and then the students can activate their own. So this study was aimed at addressing correlations between certain traits or habits and the critical thinking ability in music educator candidates. So there were 131 participants from Karadeniz Technical University. The data was collected using surveys, and they used the CCTDI-T. That is the California Critical Thinking Dispositions Inventory. And they analyzed the data using statistical analysis software. I'm going to get into a lot more of this because there are 2 more slides, because this method was kind of not too convoluted, but it requires more analysis. So here are the critical thinking criteria. So the inventory evaluates critical thinking not as a whole, but on 6 different criteria. So it analyzes your analyticity, open-mindedness, inquisitiveness, self-confidence, truth-seeking, and systematicity. Most of these are self-explanatory. The outer 2 are not, so I'll briefly cover those. Analyticity is basically how well you analyze things, looking at large amounts of data and making connections, noticing patterns, being able to apply that data to other analyses and things of that nature. And systematicity is how well one acclimates to a system. So when you're brand new, when you've got to learn some new sort of decorum or some new sort of software, how well do you do that? How quickly do you do that? The personal traits against which these skills were measured were age, gender, secondary school type, daily TV viewing frequency, parental attitudes, and frequency of book reading and frequency of newspaper reading. So they were trying to see if any of these things affected any of the previous criteria for critical thinking ability. So the findings: there were only 2 statistically significant relationships that were discovered. So only 2 of our traits actually affected criteria. So the first one was reading the paper. Those who were found to read the newspaper more often, had increases in analyticity, inquisitiveness, and self-confidence. And so they saw that actually with graphs. Well, not graphs, but the table that was included in the article. You could see as the responses increased in how often they read the paper, their analyticity, inquisitiveness, and self-confidence coefficients increased as well. So that was a direct correlation, positive correlation that they made between reading the newspaper and these 3 criteria of critical thinking. And then the second one was reading books, and this was also a positive correlation that they saw between reading books more often and increases in analyticity and self-confidence. The others, no other statistically significant relationships were discovered. So the age, which was really the criterion that I was interested in, age had no effect, and neither did any of the other. Gender had no effect. None of the other traits or habits had effects except for reading the paper and reading books. Also, the other 3 criteria were not affected. The only that were affected were analyticity, inquisitiveness, and self-confidence. So that is my presentation on these 2 research articles. Hope you enjoyed.